Jessica had been dreaming about owning her perfect home for years. After working 2 jobs and saving every penny she could, she finally had enough money for a down payment. When she saw the house at 1247 Oak Street in Riverside Gardens, she knew it was the one. The neighborhood looked like something from a magazine. Perfect green lawns, clean sidewalks, and beautiful houses all lined up in neat rows. The day she got the keys, Jessica felt like she was living in a fairy tale. She walked through her new home, touching the walls and imagining all the memories she would make there. The kitchen had granite counters that sparkled in the sunlight. The living room had big windows that let in plenty of natural light. And the backyard? It was just the right size for maybe a small garden someday. Her new neighbors seemed friendly enough. Mrs. Peterson from next door brought over fresh cookies on moving day. The young couple across the street waved and smiled whenever they saw her. Even the mailman was cheerful, always greeting her with a good morning when he delivered her mail. Jessica spent her first few weeks getting familiar with all the neighborhood rules. There were quite a few of them. The grass had to be cut every week. Garbage cans couldn't be visible from the street except on pickup days. House colors had to be approved before painting. Holiday decorations could only be up for certain periods. She didn't mind the rules. They kept the neighborhood looking nice, and that protected everyone's property values. The monthly newsletter arrived in her mailbox like clockwork. It was full of updates about community events, reminders about lawn care, and announcements about upcoming maintenance projects. Jessica enjoyed reading about her new community and felt proud to be part of such a well-organized neighborhood. But there was one name that kept appearing in every newsletter: Margaret Williamson. She seemed to be involved in everything. She was the newsletter editor, the head of the architectural review committee, and apparently the person everyone called when they had questions about the rules. At 58 years old, Margaret had lived in Riverside Gardens for over 15 years and clearly knew every rule, regulation, and procedure by heart. Jessica's first real meeting with Margaret happened on a sunny Saturday morning. Jessica was outside, watering her flowers, when a woman with perfectly styled gray hair and a clipboard walked up to her driveway. She introduced herself as Margaret and said she was just doing her regular neighborhood walkthrough. "I see you're new here," Margaret said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I like to personally welcome all our new residents and make sure everyone understands how we do things in Riverside Gardens." Jessica smiled back and thanked her for the welcome. Margaret began explaining various rules and pointing out things around Jessica's property. Most of it was stuff Jessica already knew from reading the community guidelines. But then Margaret started getting more specific. "Your mailbox needs to be cleaned weekly," Margaret said, making a note on her clipboard. "And those flower beds should be weeded more regularly. We pride ourselves on maintaining the highest standards here." Jessica looked at her flower beds, which she thought looked pretty good. Sure, there were a few small weeds, but nothing major. She politely agreed to take care of it. "Oh, and one more thing," Margaret added as she was about to leave. "I noticed you've been parking your car in the driveway overnight. While it's not technically against the rules, most residents prefer to use their garages. It keeps the street looking cleaner." Jessica was confused. She had been parking in her own driveway, which seemed perfectly normal. But she didn't want to start any trouble in her new neighborhood, so she just nodded and said she'd consider it. After Margaret left, Jessica felt a bit unsettled. The woman had been polite enough, but there was something about her tone that made Jessica feel like she was being watched and judged. She shook off the feeling and went back to enjoying her Saturday. Over the next few weeks, Jessica noticed Margaret quite often. She seemed to be everywhere, walking around the neighborhood with her clipboard, talking to other residents, and always seeming to be keeping an eye on things. Jessica would wave when she saw her, and Margaret would wave back, but there was always that same cool smile. Jessica started to feel like she was walking on eggshells. She found herself double-checking her garbage can placement, making sure her lawn was perfectly trimmed, and even moving her car into the garage more often than she really wanted to. She didn't want to be the problem neighbor that everyone talked about. The first real sign of trouble came when Jessica decided to install solar panels on her roof. She had done all her research and knew it was completely legal. The state had laws protecting homeowners' rights to install solar energy systems. She had gotten all the proper permits from the city and hired a licensed contractor to do the work. On the day the installation was finished, Jessica was admiring her new solar panels when she heard a sharp knock on her front door. She opened it to find Margaret standing there, clipboard in hand and a very different expression on her face than usual. "What is that on your roof?" Margaret demanded, pointing up at the solar panels. Jessica explained about the solar installation and how she had followed all the legal requirements. She even offered to show Margaret the permits and documentation. "Legal or not, you should have come to the Architectural Review Committee first," Margaret said, her voice getting louder. "We have procedures here. We have standards. You can't just do whatever you want without considering how it affects the rest of us." Jessica tried to explain that the state law protected her right to install solar panels, but Margaret wasn't interested in listening. She was already writing furiously on her clipboard. "This isn't over," Margaret said as she turned to leave. "There are ways to handle people who think they can ignore community standards." As Jessica watched Margaret march away, she felt her stomach sink. She had a feeling her peaceful life in Riverside Gardens was about to get much more complicated. After the solar panel incident, Jessica's life in Riverside Gardens became like living under a microscope. Every morning when she left for work, she would see Margaret somewhere in the neighborhood, walking her small white dog, checking her mailbox, or just standing in her front yard looking around. It felt like Margaret was always watching, always waiting for Jessica to make some kind of mistake. The first official complaint came just 2 weeks later. Jessica found a bright yellow notice stuck to her front door when she came home from work. It was from the HOA, signed by Margaret, stating that her garbage cans were visible from the street and needed to be moved immediately to avoid a fine. Jessica was confused. She had been very careful to put her garbage cans behind her fence, just like the rules said. She walked around to the side of her house and looked at the cans. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. You could only see a tiny corner of one can if you stood at a very specific angle and really looked for it. She took photos of the garbage can placement and sent them to the HOA office with a polite letter explaining that she was following the rules correctly. A few days later, she got a response saying the complaint had been withdrawn, but she noticed it was signed by a different board member, not Margaret. But Margaret wasn't done. The next complaint came a month later during the middle of summer. California was going through one of its worst droughts in years, and everyone was being asked to conserve water. Jessica had been doing her best to keep her lawn alive while using as little water as possible. Some parts of her grass were greener than others, which seemed pretty normal given the circumstances. The HOA notice claimed her lawn showed inconsistent maintenance and poor curb appeal. Jessica looked at her neighbors' lawns and saw that most of them looked exactly the same. Some green patches, some brown patches, all clearly suffering from the water restrictions. But apparently only Jessica's lawn was a problem. This time, Jessica decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting to address the complaint in person. She had never been to one before, but she figured it was time to start participating more in community affairs. Maybe if she showed up and explained her situation, Margaret would back off a bit. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. About 20 residents were there, mostly older folks who had lived in Riverside Gardens for many years. Jessica recognized a few faces but didn't really know anyone well enough to have a conversation. Margaret was sitting at the front table with 3 other board members. When Jessica's name came up on the agenda, she stood up and politely explained about the drought conditions and the water restrictions. She mentioned that she was doing her best to keep her lawn healthy while being a responsible citizen. Most of the board members seemed understanding. One even commented that everyone was dealing with the same challenges this summer. But Margaret had a different response. "Rules are rules, regardless of weather conditions," Margaret said firmly. "If residents can't maintain their properties according to community standards, perhaps they should consider whether this neighborhood is the right fit for them." Jessica felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. The way Margaret said it made it sound like Jessica didn't belong in Riverside Gardens. Several other residents looked uncomfortable with Margaret's tone, but nobody said anything. After the meeting, Jessica was gathering her things when Mrs. Peterson, her next-door neighbor, approached her. "Don't let Margaret get to you," Mrs. Peterson whispered. She's been like this for years. Most of us just try to stay out of her way." "Has she done this to other people?" Jessica asked. Mrs. Peterson looked around to make sure Margaret wasn't nearby. "Oh, honey, you're not the first. The family who lived in your house before you, they had problems with her too. That's actually why they moved. They got tired of the constant complaints and nitpicking." This news shocked Jessica. She had thought she was the only one having issues with Margaret. Knowing that the previous homeowners had actually moved because of these problems made Jessica feel both better and worse at the same time. Things got even more intense when Jessica decided to plant a small vegetable garden in her backyard. She had always wanted to grow her own tomatoes and peppers, and her backyard got great sunlight. She spent a weekend researching the HOA rules and found absolutely nothing that prohibited backyard gardens. The rules only talked about front yard landscaping and keeping things neat and tidy. Jessica bought some tomato plants, pepper plants, and herbs from the local nursery. She spent a beautiful Saturday afternoon planting them in a small corner of her backyard, far from the street and completely hidden from view. She was proud of her little garden and looked forward to having fresh vegetables in a few months. On Sunday morning, Jessica was having coffee on her back patio when she heard Margaret's voice calling over the fence. "What are you doing back there?" Margaret demanded. Jessica walked over to the fence where Margaret was standing on a small stepladder, looking into Jessica's backyard. "I planted a small vegetable garden," Jessica said, trying to keep her voice friendly. "Just some tomatoes and peppers." "Vegetable gardens attract pests," Margaret said, frowning. "Rats, insects, all kinds of problems. And they make the neighborhood look less upscale. People don't move to riverside gardens to live next to farms." Jessica couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her tiny garden was hardly a farm, and it was completely hidden in her backyard where no one could even see it. "I checked the HOA rules carefully," Jessica said. "There's nothing that prohibits backyard gardens." Margaret's face turned red. "Well, we'll just see about that. I'm calling an emergency architectural review meeting. This kind of thing needs to be discussed properly." Jessica watched Margaret stomp away, feeling frustrated and confused. She had been so careful to follow the rules, but it seemed like Margaret was determined to find problems no matter what Jessica did. She was beginning to understand why the previous homeowners had decided to move away. The emergency architectural review meeting happened exactly 1 week after Margaret discovered Jessica's garden. Jessica arrived at the community center feeling nervous, but prepared. She had printed out copies of the HOA rules, highlighted the sections about landscaping, and even brought photos of her small garden to show how neat and tidy it was. The meeting room felt tense. Margaret sat at the head of the table with 2 other board members, Mr. Chen, who seemed like a reasonable person, and Mrs. Rodriguez, who mostly just nodded along with whatever Margaret said. About a dozen neighbors had shown up, which was unusual for these meetings. Margaret wasted no time getting to the point. "We're here because one of our residents has decided to install a vegetable garden without proper approval," she announced, looking directly at Jessica. "This sets a dangerous precedent for our community standards." Jessica stood up with her documents in hand. "I'd like to present my research on this matter," she said politely. She walked through the HOA rules page by page, showing exactly where landscaping was mentioned and pointing out that there were no restrictions on backyard gardens. Mr. Chen looked through the documents carefully. "It seems like you did your homework," he said. "The rules do appear to allow for this type of gardening in the backyard area." Margaret's face started turning red. "The rules also state that any changes to property must maintain neighborhood character and property values," she argued. "Gardens attract rodents and insects. They create odors. They make the area look less professional. Have you actually seen any evidence of these problems?" Mr. Chen asked. Margaret stammered for a moment. "Well, no, but it's only been a week. These problems take time to develop." Mrs. Peterson, who had been sitting quietly in the back, suddenly spoke up. "I live right next door to Jessica, and I think her garden is lovely. It's very neat and you can't even see it from the street. I don't understand what the problem is." A few other neighbors nodded in agreement. One man mentioned that he had been thinking about starting his own garden and was glad to know it was allowed. The vote was quick. Mr. Chen and the third board member agreed that Jessica's garden was within the HOA guidelines. Margaret was clearly outvoted, but she didn't take it well. "This is a mistake," she said through gritted teeth. "Mark my words, we'll regret this decision." After the meeting ended, Jessica felt relieved but also worried. She had won this battle, but Margaret looked absolutely furious. As people were leaving, Margaret cornered Jessica in the parking lot. "You think you're so smart with your research? And your legal documents," Margaret hissed, stepping uncomfortably close to Jessica. "But I know what kind of person you really are. This neighborhood was peaceful and perfect before people like you started moving in and causing trouble." Jessica didn't know what to say. She had been nothing but polite and respectful to everyone. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said quietly. "I just want to be a good neighbor." "Good neighbors don't challenge community leaders," Margaret snapped. "Good neighbors follow guidance from people who have been here longer and know how things work." With that, Margaret stormed off to her car, leaving Jessica standing alone in the parking lot feeling shaken and confused. Over the next few weeks, Jessica tried to go back to her normal routine. Her little garden was growing beautifully, and she enjoyed tending to it in the evenings after work. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was planning something. She noticed Margaret walking by her house more often, always with that clipboard, always seeming to be looking for something wrong. The strange incident started small. Jessica's newspaper would sometimes disappear from her driveway. Her garbage cans would be knocked over on windy days, even though her neighbors' cans were fine. Someone had apparently called the city to complain about her solar panels, because an inspector showed up one day to check them. The inspector found nothing wrong and seemed confused about why he had been called. Then Jessica started getting weird phone calls. The caller would hang up as soon as she answered. It happened 3 or 4 times a week, always during dinner time. She couldn't prove it was Margaret, but the timing was suspicious. The final straw came when Jessica's mail started arriving late or not at all. She had been expecting an important package from work, but it never showed up. When she asked the mailman about it, he looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I've been told there might be some issues with your address," he said quietly. "Someone called the post office to say there were problems with delivery to your house. I had to verify your address with my supervisor before I could keep delivering here." Jessica was shocked. "What kind of problems?" "I've lived here for months, without any issues." The mailman shrugged. "I don't know the details, but you might want to call the post office to clear it up." When Jessica called the post office, they told her that someone had filed a complaint, claiming that her house number was wrong, and that she might be receiving mail fraudulently. It took Jessica 2 hours on the phone and a visit to the post office, with multiple forms of identification to straighten out the mess. That evening, Jessica sat in her backyard looking at her thriving tomato plants and trying to figure out what to do. She had never dealt with anything like this before. All she had wanted was to live peacefully in her new home, but somehow she had ended up in some kind of war with Margaret. She thought about what Mrs. Peterson had told her about the previous homeowners moving away because of similar problems. Jessica didn't want to move. She loved her house and had worked so hard to buy it, but she was starting to understand why some people just gave up and left. As she sat there thinking, Jessica realized that Margaret's behavior was getting worse, not better. The woman seemed to be escalating her campaign against Jessica, and there was no telling what she might do next. Jessica knew she needed to start documenting everything, and maybe even talk to someone about her legal options. She had tried being nice, being reasonable, and following all the rules. But it was becoming clear that Margaret wasn't interested in being reasonable. Something had to change, and Jessica was starting to think that she might need to take a stronger stand. 3 weeks after the mail incident, Jessica's monthly HOA newsletter arrived as usual. She was making her morning coffee when she flipped through the familiar pages about pool maintenance schedules and upcoming community events. But when she reached page 4, her coffee mug nearly slipped from her hands. There, in black and white, was an article titled, "Protecting Our Community Standards, a Neighborhood Watch Report." Jessica's heart started pounding as she read the first paragraph. The article didn't mention her name directly, but it was obviously about her. It talked about a problematic resident who had been disrupting community harmony and using legal loopholes to avoid following neighborhood guidelines. But as Jessica kept reading, the article got much worse. It claimed that this unnamed resident had been investigated multiple times by city code enforcement for various violations. That was completely false. Jessica had never had any code enforcement issues at all. The article went on to say that the resident was operating some kind of business from their home, causing increased traffic and noise in our quiet neighborhood. Jessica worked from home for a tech company, but she rarely had visitors and certainly wasn't running any kind of business that would affect her neighbors. The worst part came near the end. The article stated that this resident had shown disrespect toward longtime community members and had used inappropriate language during official HOA meetings. Jessica's stomach dropped. She had always been polite and professional at the one meeting she had attended. She had never raised her voice or said anything inappropriate to anyone. The article was signed, "Concerned Neighbors," but Jessica knew exactly who had written it. Margaret's writing style was distinctive, and she was the newsletter editor. This wasn't just gossip between neighbors. This was printed information being sent to every single house in Riverside Gardens. Jessica's phone started ringing almost immediately. The first call was from Mrs. Peterson. "Jessica, honey, I just read the newsletter," Mrs. Peterson said, sounding upset. "I hope you know that not everyone believes this nonsense. I've been your neighbor for months and you've been nothing but lovely. But not all the calls were supportive." Jessica's doorbell rang around noon, and she found a neighbor she barely knew standing on her porch looking angry. "Are you the one causing all these problems in the neighborhood?" the woman demanded. "I didn't spend good money to live here just to have property values go down because of troublemakers." Jessica tried to explain that the newsletter article was full of lies, but the woman had already made up her mind. "Where there's smoke, there's fire," she said before walking away. By the end of the day, Jessica felt completely overwhelmed. Some neighbors were supportive, but others had clearly believed everything they read in the newsletter. She realized that her reputation in the community was being destroyed by lies and she didn't know how to fix it. That evening, Jessica called her sister Lisa, who worked as a paralegal at a law firm in the city. "This sounds like defamation to me," Lisa said after Jessica read her the newsletter article. "Publishing false statements that damage someone's reputation is a serious legal matter. You need to talk to a lawyer." "But it's just a neighborhood." "Newsletter," Jessica said. "Is it really that big of a deal?" "Jessica, this went to how many houses? 800? 900? And it's probably online too. This isn't just neighborhood gossip. This is published material with wide distribution that contains false statements about you." Lisa was right. Jessica checked the neighborhood website and found the newsletter posted there, along with the community Facebook page. The lies about her were now available for anyone to see, including potential employers, friends, or anyone who might search for information about her online. The next morning, Jessica contacted a lawyer who specialized in defamation cases. Attorney Patricia Wong listened carefully as Jessica explained the situation and brought copies of the newsletter. "This is a clear case of libel," Attorney Wong said. "The article contains specific false statements of fact that have damaged your reputation. The fact that the author used their position as newsletter editor makes it even more serious." Attorney Wong explained that Jessica had several options. She could send a cease and desist letter demanding a public retraction and apology. If that didn't work, she could file a lawsuit for defamation. "I don't want to sue anyone," Jessica said. "I just want this to stop. I want to live peacefully in my neighborhood." "I understand," Attorney Wong said. "Let's start with the cease and desist letter. Sometimes that's enough to make people realize they've gone too far." The letter was delivered to Margaret 3 days later. It demanded that she publish a full retraction and apology in the next newsletter, remove the false article from all online platforms, and stop making defamatory statements about Jessica. Margaret's response came through the HOA's lawyer and was shocking in its tone. The letter stated that the newsletter article was legitimate community commentary and protected opinion based on observed behaviors. It claimed that Margaret had every right to warn neighbors about disruptive residents and refused to retract anything. Attorney Wong shook her head when she read Margaret's response. This woman doesn't understand the difference between opinion and false statements of fact. Saying someone was investigated by code enforcement when they weren't isn't opinion. It's a lie. Even worse, Jessica discovered that Margaret hadn't stopped with just the newsletter. She had apparently sent copies to several local real estate agents, claiming that Jessica's behavior was affecting property values in the neighborhood. Margaret had also posted about the situation in local Facebook groups, spreading the false information even further. The HOA's own lawyer was clearly uncomfortable with Margaret's actions. He sent a separate letter to Jessica explaining that the HOA organization itself was distancing itself from Margaret's newsletter article and would publish a clarification in the next issue, but the damage was already done. Jessica's neighbors were divided into camps, those who believed Margaret's lies and those who supported Jessica. The community that had once seemed so perfect was now full of tension and conflict. Jessica realized she had reached a point where being nice and reasonable wasn't working anymore. Margaret had crossed a line from petty harassment into serious defamation that could affect Jessica's life and career. It was time to take stronger action to protect herself and her reputation. With Margaret refusing to back down, Jessica made the difficult decision to file a defamation lawsuit. She had never sued anyone before and felt nervous about the whole process, but Attorney Wong assured her that she had a strong case. Sometimes, people need to face real consequences before they understand that their actions have serious effects on others, Attorney Wong explained. Margaret clearly thinks she can say whatever she wants without any accountability. The lawsuit filing sent shockwaves through Riverside Gardens. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and Jessica found herself at the center of intense community discussion. Some neighbors approached her with support, while others seemed to avoid her completely. During the legal discovery process, Attorney Wong uncovered information that surprised even Jessica. It turned out that Margaret had a history of similar behavior with other residents. The HOA's files contained complaints from 3 previous homeowners about Margaret's harassment and false accusations. 2 of those families had actually moved away, citing Margaret's behavior as one of the reasons. This shows a clear pattern, Attorney Wong told Jessica. Margaret has been doing this for years, and the HOA has been quietly trying to manage the situation instead of addressing it properly. But the most shocking discovery came when Attorney Wong reviewed Margaret's communications with the city and other organizations. Margaret had filed multiple false complaints about Jessica with the Code Enforcement Office, claiming everything from illegal business operations to building code violations. None of these complaints had any basis in reality. Even worse, Margaret had contacted Jessica's employer, sending them a copy of the newsletter article and claiming that Jessica was causing neighborhood disturbances that might reflect poorly on the company. Fortunately, Jessica's boss knew her well enough to dismiss Margaret's claims, but the attempt to damage Jessica's career crossed a major line. When Margaret was questioned under oath during her deposition, she seemed to believe that her position as newsletter editor gave her the right to publish whatever she wanted about her neighbors. I have a responsibility to inform the community about potential problems, Margaret insisted. That's what good leadership looks like. But these statements about code enforcement investigations and business operations were completely false, Attorney Wong pointed out. Did you verify any of this information before publishing it? Margaret's face turned red. I don't need to verify obvious problems. Anyone with eyes can see what's happening. So you admit you published statements as facts without checking if they were true? I published legitimate concerns based on my observations and experience in this community. Margaret's attitude during the deposition actually hurt her case. She showed no regret for the false statements and even added new unfounded claims about Jessica's character. It was clear she didn't understand the seriousness of what she had done. The case took an unexpected turn when the district attorney's office got involved. Attorney Wong had shared the evidence of Margaret's false complaints to city offices and her attempts to interfere with Jessica's employment. The prosecutor determined that Margaret's actions went beyond simple defamation into criminal territory. On a quiet Tuesday morning in March, Jessica was working from home when she heard commotion outside her window. She looked out to see a police car parked in front of Margaret's house across the street. 2 officers were walking up to Margaret's front door. Within minutes, Jessica's phone was buzzing with calls and text messages from neighbors. Word spread quickly that Margaret had been arrested on charges of criminal harassment and filing false police reports. The sight of Margaret being led away in handcuffs became the talk of Riverside Gardens for weeks. Many neighbors who had initially believed the newsletter article began to realize they had been manipulated. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived 3 houses down, knocked on Jessica's door the next day. "I owe you an apology," she said, looking embarrassed. "I believed what Margaret wrote about you, and I even repeated some of it to other neighbors. I feel terrible about it now." Similar apologies came from other residents over the following days. People who had avoided Jessica or treated her coldly began to understand that they had been fed false information by someone they had trusted as a community leader. The civil lawsuit went to trial 6 months later. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach their decision. They found Margaret guilty of defamation and awarded Jessica $75,000 in damages. The judge also issued a permanent restraining order preventing Margaret from contacting Jessica or publishing anything about her. In the criminal case, Margaret was convicted of harassment and filing false reports. She received 2 years of probation, 300 hours of community service, and was required to attend anger management classes. The judge made it clear that any further harassment of Jessica would result in jail time. The HOA board removed Margaret from all her positions immediately. After her conviction, the newsletter was temporarily suspended and later restarted under the management of a rotating committee of volunteers. The new newsletter included a disclaimer about fact-checking and responsible communication. Margaret's house went up for sale 2 months after the trial ended. She moved out of Riverside Gardens quietly one weekend, and Jessica never saw her again. The ordeal taught Jessica valuable lessons about standing up for herself when faced with bullying behavior. She had learned that sometimes being nice and reasonable isn't enough when dealing with people who are determined to cause problems. Jessica eventually joined the HOA board herself, working to create policies that would prevent future harassment situations. She pushed for clear procedures for handling neighbor disputes and established guidelines for newsletter content to ensure accuracy and fairness. Her little vegetable garden continued to thrive, and she often shared tomatoes and peppers with neighbors, who had become genuine friends through the difficult experience. Mrs. Peterson became a close friend, and they often sat together in Jessica's backyard, enjoying the peaceful evenings that Jessica had originally dreamed of when she bought her home. The neighborhood slowly healed from the division and conflict that Margaret's behavior had created. Riverside Gardens returned to being the peaceful community that Jessica had fallen in love with. But now she knew she had the strength and support to handle any future challenges that might arise. Most importantly, Jessica had learned that her home truly was her castle, and she had every right to defend it from those who would try to make her life miserable. The legal system had worked exactly as it was supposed to, protecting innocent people from those who would abuse their positions of trust and authority.